talk a little bit about some of your activities during this period between 60 and 74 or so when you were basically in
Right.
private practice. You were getting involved in other activities in the area, the bar association. You became a Republican? Were you active in party politics?
I was. Well, I was very active for a time. I was a county committeeman, and I was in the Young Republicans. I even managed Jim Mitchell's campaign in Morris County. I never told Chief Justice Hughes this, but Morris County being a Republican county, Mitchell won in Morris. He lost in the other states, and Hughes became the governor. But I became president of the Occupational Training Center for the Handicapped, which has a different name now. I was counsel for the local New Jersey Association of Retarded Children. I was on the board of my church, the Presbyterian Church here in Morristown. Ultimately, was on the editorial board of the Law Journal. I can't remember some of the other.
The New Jersey Law Journal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suspect there were other things, but I can't recall them.
Well, you must have been very busy between your outside activities, your practice, and your growing family.
All true, because we had 4 children in 6 years. Wendy was born in 58, Stu in 59, Jeff in 61, and Jenny in 64. So we had a lot going on. Yes.
So, do any of those activities, anything that you got involved in, stand out? Were you involved in any committees through the Bar Association that were working on issues in the county?
Yeah. At some point, I became a trustee of the state bar, and I remember testifying in support of a bill that at that time didn't get passed, the Administrative Procedure Act, testifying on behalf of the Bar Association. And later, when I was counsel of the governor, we got the bill through, and that gave rise to the Office of Administrative Law. But going back to that period, I remember one of the things I learned from that, particularly, it was dealing with the New Jersey Association of Retarded Children. Was how supportive family members were of children who had learning problems or other disabilities, and the effect that could have on the family. And I know that popped up that notion popped up in a case. Judges, I think, at least this judge, inevitably was a product of the experience you have along the way, and that was one that affected me. The other thing was with the Occupational Training Center for the Handicapped, I gained an appreciation of something that I think blossomed more fully while I was on the court, and that is the inherent dignity of every person and every individual. Those were two of the things. One other thing that happened when I left the U.S. Attorney's Office. In those days, there was a system. It was not a very good system at all, of U.S. commissioners. It's since been replaced by the federal magistrates. But when I left, the then Chief Judge, O'Gelly, called and said, I need a U.S. Commissioner for Northwestern New Jersey. The federal Chief Judge got to make the appointment. And he said, "I'd like you to do it." Well, when the chief judge asked something like that, there's only one answer. So anyhow, I became the U.S. Commissioner for Northwestern New Jersey, which gave me jurisdiction over, over Picatinny Arsenal, the National Park here in Morristown, and preliminary jurisdiction over essentially northwestern New Jersey. And my weighty responsibility was to post bail for people who were arrested, or hold them over, issue search warrants, and then I actually had hearings on minor offenses, and I forget how minor was defined, but it had something to do with I'm sure the period of incarceration or the size of the penalty. Here and for offenses arising out of the national park or on Picatinny. I did that for a few years, and then I can't remember when I stopped, but that was my introduction to judging.
Do you remember what kind of folks you would see before you, or what they had done? Or?
A lot of FBI agents, and if there were a bank robbery and they found the suspect, the culprit, they would bring him in, and I would advise him of his rights. An awful lot of these events occurred on a Friday night, and I wondered why. It might have had something to do with the fact there was no federal judge available until Monday. But I remember sitting down with my family and having dinner Friday night. The phone would ring and the FBI would say, "We've just made an arrest," and so on and forth. I would come down to my office and advise the person of his right to counsel and so forth. But that was just one of the things. You're going back to your earlier comment, yes, it was a very happy, busy time.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting into a period that is covered very well in the October 2010 interview that was conducted by Michael Aaron at Rutgers for the Eagleton Project regarding your time working in the Byrne administration. So I don't want to go over all that, but there are a couple issues I want to
Sure.
pick over a little bit. First, I wanted to kind of get into the notion of public service that you have touched on, that it tied in with the scholarship that you received at NYU. Can you kind of explain that a little more in depth?
Sure. One of the tenets of the program was that if the opportunity to serve the public arises, you should do it. Mm-hmm. And that was something Vanderbilt strongly believed. Vanderbilt had 5 functions of a lawyer. I'm not so sure I can remember all of them, but one of them was that a lawyer should accept an opportunity to serve the public. And that did surface and was part of the motivation to leave private practice and to join the Byrne administration.
Were there other times earlier than that you felt this call, either that panned out into something, or?
It may have had something to do with my going into the U.S. Attorney's Office or becoming a U.S. Commissioner. But I think, and it may have had something to do with the fact that I was active politically, but the opportunity, quite frankly, didn't arrive until Brendan Byrne offered it to me.
I also wanted to ask, at this time, there were a number of factions within the Republican Party. There was the, excuse me, more centrist or liberal wing with Rockefeller and others, Clifford Case.
Clifford Case, for sure.
So, and then there was the Goldwater spectrum. Where would you kind of define yourself?
I was lined up with Clifford Case. I pinch hit for him at some speaking engagements, and I was active on his behalf.
Okay, all right. Would you have any events for him in Morris County when he would run for re-election?
I'm sure I did,
Okay.
but I can't recall what they were. I remember becoming active in his campaign, and I remember speaking at Drew University.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. One of the things that comes up again over and over again when there's articles about your career or things written is how you try to bring together different sides and certainly being a Republican in a Democratic administration, you'd probably have to do that a lot. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Like, what is your philosophy regarding that kind of, I don't know, consensus building?
Well, I think it's, to the extent that it's true that I do that, I think it's just part of who I am. And it may start with being the middle child, I don't know. Although I wouldn't put too much weight on that one. But I guess I think that frequently, particularly in public affairs, no one side has a monopoly on the right position, and that this may go back to the philosophy major in the search for the golden mean. Often the right answer is the result of compromise between two extreme positions. I don't know what else I can add to that at this time.
Do you think at the time it was easier for people to build that kind of consensus, or for both sides to work together?
Well, you hear a lot about that now. I just don't. I don't know. Although you certainly read a lot and hear a lot that suggests that is true. I guess I've always operated on the premise that if you treat people openly, honestly, fairly, reasonably, you can reach a point of agreement with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that's not universally true, not an absolute truth, but I think it's a good operating principle.
Did that have, I mean, today that could have negative consequences for somebody working with another party. Did that have any negative consequences for you at the time?
Sort of, yeah. I had, when I came up, well, I guess initially for appointment, more clearly when I came up for reappointment, one of my then senators, who was a Republican, threatened to exercise senatorial courtesy, and I'm not so sure he mentioned the fact that I had been part of a Democratic administration, but he thought I had been too liberal in the opinions that I'd written and that I had joined. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, he decided not to exercise senatorial courtesy, and I went forward with the nomination.
Okay. Well, that's something I want to ask
Sure.
about later on. So you first were active with the Byrne administration as the head of the Department of Public Utilities.
One of the three commissioners, right?
Okay. And then you briefly went back into private practice, and then you were counsel for Governor
Yes,
Byrne.
yes.
Okay. So, and then in '79, he nominated you to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
All right. Tell me about that experience. How did you first learn that you had been nominated? Was there any kind of hints being put in your way that this might happen?
Well, as my predecessor, Worrell Mountain, as his term, the end of his term approached, people started to speculate about who would replace him. And curiously, at the same time, Chief Justice Hughes's term was coming to a close. They both were approaching the mandatory retirement age of 70. And so the speculation began about who would replace them. And I know the press was kind enough to suggest that I might be an appropriate replacement for Worrell Mountain. And I remember the day the governor told me he wanted to put me on the court. In those days, I don't know if it's still true or not, but in those days, as you walked in the State House, the counsel's office was on the right and the governor's office was on the left. And Dottie Seltzer, the governor's secretary, called and said, "Stu, you better come over. The governor wants to see you." So I went over, and he put this piece of paper down and said, "You better fill this out." And I said, "Why?" He said, "I'm putting you on the Supreme Court." And so I filled it out.
To start again, I wanted to just ask, before we get into your confirmation hearings and that process, in your role as counsel to Governor Byrne, had your work there brought you into contact with the Supreme Court? Do you have any memories of working with Justice Hughes, for example, before you actually joined the court?
There were a couple of instances I know when he would call, ask what was going on a particular issue, and of course, I remember once I went over to see him, and he was one of God's noblemen on earth. He was for a man who had done so much so well, he was a very modest person. And I remember going into his office, and he had on a dress shirt, a frayed dress shirt. Beneath it was a T-shirt that said "Sugar Daddy." But that was just Dick Hughes.
Mm. So you told the story of how you went into Governor Byrne's office. He had you fill out the paperwork. What happened from that point? What did you have to do to prepare yourself for the confirmation process?
Not much. I really didn't have to do much at all. I knew a lot of the senators from having worked with them in the counsel's office, but I really didn't do much at all.
Mm-hmm. Was there a lot of press coverage when you were named as the nominee? Do you remember if you were guided in any way through that experience?
I don't recall doing much at all. I'm sure I did something for the initial appointment, and I think it went very smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Was the actual confirmation hearing all accomplished in one day, or did it take longer
I'm
than
sure it was. I remember I went before the State Bar Committee, going before the Senate, but there wasn't much of a flap about it at all. I think there were a couple of senators who voted against me, including the senator from Morris. But other than that, I just don't recall much about it at all. I remember being in the Senate chamber when the entire Senate voted, but that's about it.
Mhm. And then how soon after was your swearing-in ceremony?
Well, I think I was nominated in March, confirmed in May, and if my recollection is correct, I was sworn in mid-June or late June.
Mhm. Any memories of the ceremony?
Oh, lots. Yeah, I mean, my wife was there, my children were there, obviously. Friends, family, of course the governor and the entire Supreme Court. No, it was a very happy day.
Mm. Now, after being sworn in, when was your first
Right, well,
conference, I guess?
okay, well, I was actually sworn in while Chief Justice Hughes was Chief Justice, so there was a period of like 60 days or so when I technically was a member of his court. They were wrapping up the work for the summer, and so I didn't do anything.
Mm.
The one thing I did do, and it was a good idea, I took a course in judicial opinion writing that summer. Of course, ever since law school, I've been reading opinions, but it's one thing to read and another to write them. And I took a course out at the University of Colorado, and that was excellent. It gave me a good handhold on how to write opinions.
Mm.
And then Robert Walentz was sworn in shortly after me as Chief Justice, and he and I both started in the fall.
Mm-hmm. So you don't have many memories of how Chief Justice Hughes operated in terms of how he ran his court?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't.
Or any impressions, again, about him personally? Or
Well, I do recall
as a
one
jurist?
thing. He did something, I don't know if any other Chief Justice has ever done it, but at least once a year he goes to visit a maximum security prison, or at least he did. And I remember after I was nominated, and it may have been after I was confirmed, he called me up and he said, "Stu," he said, "I'm going over to Rahway, East Jersey State Prison. How would you like to join me?" So off we went. I was still counsel to the governor, and this is just typical of the kind of person he was. He would go in there and actually meet with people who were serving pretty tough sentences. And what I remember going with him, and the call came in while I was there, and I had to get back to the State House for something. And I had to leave just at the time when the first group of prisoners was coming in for lunch. And I remember he was walking in, the prisoners were walking in as I was walking out, and one of them spit on my shoes. And I thought, what do I do? And I quickly told myself, you keep on walking. But Chief Justice Hughes was remarkable in that regard. His father had briefly been the warden of Trenton State, and Chief Justice Hughes just naturally had an interest in seeing the prisoners, and he did.
Do you think it had the effect that he intended for the people who came and visited?
I don't know, but it could not have hurt at all.
Mm-hmm.
He was a remarkable person.
Well, I'm interested in this course that you took at Colorado. You know, again, in reading some of the press coverage of your time on the court, people comment about your opinions being, you know, effective but brief, not flowery. Was that part of what you were taught there?
Yes, exactly. That was one of the points, and I'm not so sure they taught this as a principle. But one of the principles that I used in writing opinions was state only the facts you need to support the legal principles, and state only the legal principles you need to resolve the issues presented by the facts. I tried to keep my opinions tight. I wanted them to be scholarly, thorough, reasonable, but I did not want to write overblown opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Because people have to read them, and lawyers have to read them, and I did not want to impose on anybody by overwriting.
So when did the you know, activity under Chief Justice Walentz begin? Was that September?
Robert was sworn in, I think, July or August, and then then the term began in September, and that was when the work really began before September, because you have to read the bench memos, the briefs, and the cases that you're going to hear in September, and then you always have motions and petitions for certification coming out over the summer. So the work really began over the summer, and then we hit the ground running with the first arguments.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've heard from some of the other justices. Go ahead. I've heard from some of the other justices kind of the procedure of how the conferences and the hearings would work. But I was wondering if, you know, being somebody that was there right at the beginning, was he kind of continuing the way Chief Justice Hughes had done things? Was he coming up with his own way of doing things? Do you have a sense of that?
I have a sense that his practices were pretty much the same as Chief Justice Hughes and the prior Chief Justices, in that, you know, at the conference, they would discuss the cases heard, first circulating opinions, then the cases heard the preceding week. He would assign the opinions. That is a major consideration, and that is a power that the Chief Justice has because the court permits it. There's nothing in a statute or rule that says the Chief Justice shall assign the opinions, at least not to my knowledge. But it's the way we've always done things in New Jersey since Arthur T. Vanderbilt. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way it is, and it works. So I really can't say too much about a comparative analysis of how Robert Walentz worked versus other Chief Justices. I think they pretty much function the same way.
Well, if you wouldn't mind sharing your memories of what a typical cycle would be like.
Sure.
And your work, your role in the system.
Well, it would start with the preparation for the oral arguments, which involved reading the briefs and the bench memos and relevant portions of the record. then you would go to the arguments on Monday and Tuesday. I would then, at the end of each day of oral argument, I forced myself the whole 20 years I was on the court to dictate a memo with a tentative resolution of the case, lots of questions to be answered, but I wanted the discipline of addressing the case while it was fresh in my mind. So I would do that each night after oral argument, and then when we come back to conference, I would distribute those memos to my clerks, and they would come back to me with answers to the questions on which I would base the position I was going to take at the conference the following week. And then you would also, during the balance of the week, you would review circulating opinions from the other justices, petitions for certifications, motions, administrative matters. And then the following Tuesday, there would be the conference. And that was the toughest day in the 2-week cycle. Those were long, hard days. And then you would come back from the conference at which at least one opinion would have been assigned. And I usually would work with one clerk on each opinion. It was rare to get more than one clerk involved. And I would dictate what I thought was the appropriate outcome, what the reasoning was, what the leading cases were, and then they would go to work and try to polish it up. And then they would come into me with a draft. I would then rewrite it, and we would go back and forth until we had something we wanted to circulate. And then there were administrative responsibilities. The chief, Robert Walentz, was very much committed to discharging his administrative responsibilities and to enlisting the aid of the court in doing it. So that was roughly how the 2-week cycle worked.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about your approach to selecting clerks, and you described a little bit your working relationship.
Right.
Any other aspects of that
Well,
relationship?
I wanted to make sure that I had at least one clerk from a New Jersey law school, and I tried to balance it out in terms of gender. Tried to balance it out in terms of race. So I looked for diversity among the clerks, and I felt that out of the interaction of people with different viewpoints, we had a better chance of arriving at the right result. And so that's what I did. They remain very much a part of my family, a part of my extended family.